Hello again. This is part 2 of chapter 2 of our human biology textbook. And in part 1, we looked at the parts of an individual atom and talked about what would cause two individual atoms to react with one another. And that was that goal of filling their valence electrons, filling their outer shell with 8 valence electrons so that they could meet that octet rule and become stable. And when that happens, when 2 or more elements are bumping around in space, when they interact with one another and combine and form a new substance, that new substance is called a compound. A compound is formed when 2 atoms of a different type interact with one another. So for example, if you have 2 atoms of oxygen that interact with one another to make oxygen gas, that would not be an example of a compound because both of the elements are oxygen. That would be an example of a molecule. 2 elements of the same kind coming together is a molecule. If they are different kinds, then they're going to make a new substance, something totally different, and that's going to be a compound. So let's look at an example of that. Here we have this shiny metal. It's a solid substance, and this is the element sodium, which is abbreviated by Na. And then we have this odorless gas. That is the element chloride. So 2 very different elements on their own. But when they react with one another, what happens is they form this completely different, the substance with completely different properties. And they do that by creating bonds. So do you know what happens when an element or an atom of sodium interacts with an atom of chloride? We get table salt, that common NaCl. And NaCl, sodium chloride, interacts with one another by forming what we call an ionic bond. So let's look at how that happens. An ionic bond is formed when 1 or more electrons is transferred or moved from one atom to another, which causes a change in the electrical charge of both of those atoms. So if we are looking at the atomic model of the elements of sodium and the element of chloride, we see that sodium has only 1 valence electron. Only 1 electron in its outer shell. It has 1, 2, 3 shells, but there's only 1 electron out here. So in order for sodium to become stable and meet its octet rule, the easiest thing for it to do would be to lose this electron because its next inner shell is complete, having 8 valence electrons. So sodium would be happy to lose that electron. Chloride, on the other hand, a single atom has 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 valence electrons. So in order for it to meet the octet rule and have a complete set of 8 on its valence electron, the easiest thing for it to do would be to gain an electron. So they're kind of a perfect match for one another. Sodium wants to lose 1. Chloride wants to gain 1. And that's exactly what's going to happen. They are going to form an ionic bond. And sodium is going to donate or transfer its extra valence electron to chloride. When this happens, we now have a change in the electrical charge because now sodium has 1 more proton in the nucleus than it has electrons. Because remember, when it was not charged, when it was a pure element, the number of protons equaled the number of electrons. But now sodium has lost an electron, lost one of its negative charges. And that's going to give it that positive 1 charge because it has 1 more proton in the nucleus then it has electrons in its shell. Chloride, on the other hand, gained an electron. So now it has one more electron than it has protons in the nucleus, giving it that -1 charge, one extra electron. The ionic bond that's formed here is one of the weaker kinds of bonds because it's not sharing anything. There's not going to be any overlap between the shells of the sodium ion and the electron shells of the chloride ion. The only thing that's going to be holding these two atoms together to make table salt is the attraction between the positive charge of the sodium and the negative charge of the chloride. So that makes ionic bonds one of the weaker types of bonds. An example of a strong bond would be a covalent bond. These are formed when two atoms share one or more electrons to complete their octet. So I always remember covalent as sharing because it's cooperative. Covalent, cooperative is sharing. The example that I have shown here, which can be abbreviated CH4, 1 carbon and 4 hydrogen, is methane, a very common gas in the atmosphere. And we remember, hopefully, that carbon has 4 valence electrons. And we can see from the periodic table that hydrogen will only have 1 valence electron. So one hydrogen atom shares its electron with each of carbon's 4 electrons. So this is the formation of 4 separate covalent bonds. It would be really impractical to try to write out the atomic structure every single time, showing the number of electrons each time. So because this is an example of 4 single covalent bonds, we can abbreviate that as drawing a single line, showing that this carbon is sharing a single pair of electrons with that hydrogen, a single pair of electrons with that hydrogen, a single pair of electrons with that hydrogen, and a single pair of electrons with this hydrogen. So there is a covalent bond formed between each of those shared pairs of electrons. So the the molecule of methane is made of 4 single covalent bonds. Bonds that involve sharing of electrons between the individual atoms. Atoms can also form double and triple covalent bonds, depending on the number of electron pairs that are shared between each atom. So for example, carbon dioxide, the carbon atom has 4 valence electrons, and each oxygen atom has 6. So the carbon atom has to form 2 pairs. So that will be an example of a double covalent bond. And that can be abbreviated using a double line, indicating that it is sharing 2 pairs of electrons. And then nitrogen gas is going to share 3 pairs of electrons. So that can be abbreviated as 3 lines, a triple covalent bond, in order to meet its octet rule in both atoms. Here's a quick review. Is nitrogen gas, N2, an example of a compound? Hopefully you said no. Nitrogen gas is a molecule because it involves 2 atoms coming together, but it is not a compound because the 2 atoms that are coming together are of the same type. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, is both a molecule and a compound because it involves 2 different types of atoms. Let's take a look at one of the most important compounds or molecules that we are going to be looking at throughout this semester, and that would be water. So the 2 types of atoms that are found in one molecule of water going to be 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. And they are going to form single covalent bonds, and there will be 2 of them. So single covalent bonds between the oxygen and each of the hydrogens. Because these slightly charged, or these bonds are unequally distributed, they're going to form these kind of like charged regions on the molecule of oxygen. So the side that contains the 2 hydrogen atoms is going to have a slightly positive charge. And then the opposite side of the oxygen atom that does not contain the hydrogen is going to have a slightly negative charge. And this is an example of a polar bond. So it's a polar covalent bond. It's covalent because it involves the sharing of electrons, one from the oxygen and one from the hydrogen. But it's polar because it's creating these slightly charged regions. So we're going to see that because of those slightly charged regions, individual molecules of water have this tendency to stick together because the slightly negative side on one molecule is going to be attracted to the slightly positive side of the next molecule. And those are called hydrogen bonds. So if we're talking about like a glass of water, a pile of molecules of water, we're going to find polar covalent bonds, but also hydrogen bonds. The attractions between those slightly positively charged regions with the hydrogen atoms and the slightly negative charged regions on the other side of that oxygen atom. We will talk about water a lot this semester because we are made up of primarily water and it drives a lot of the physiological processes that we're going to talk about. So let's look at some of the unique properties of water that's going to explain some of the phenomena that we see that go on within our body. So one we just looked at is water is cohesive, has the tendency to stick together, stick to other molecules of water because of those polar regions, slightly negative attracting to the slightly positive. This is what gives water that surface tension that we see. But not only does water stick to itself, it's also adhesive, and it has the tendency to stick to other molecules as well, because other molecules are going to have slightly positive or slightly negative regions also if they also contain polar bonds. Water is also considered a universal solvent because it reacts readily with almost all other substances. And it has a high heat capacity, so it requires a lot of heat to raise the temperature of water. And because it requires a lot of heat to raise the temperature, that means that it will also have a high heat of vaporization, meaning that it needs a lot of heat to change the state from a liquid to a gas. Because water is that universal solvent and reacts so readily with other substances, we can classify the properties of other substances based on how it interacts with water. And we do that by either calling it an acid or a base. So an acid is anything that when placed in water releases hydrogen ions, increasing its acidity. And a base is anything that when it's placed in water releases hydroxide ions, increasing its alkalinity, or another way of saying basic. So if it's acidic, when it's placed in water, it's going to release hydrogen ions. If it's basic, when it's placed in water, it's going to release hydroxide ions. And pH, we will see, is one of the big examples of a homeostasis that our body works really, really hard to maintain. The pH of our blood, for example, because that's going to determine whether or not the enzymes within the blood are going to be able to function. And we will pick up with those major molecules in part 3 of this video, or of this chapter.